Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Very grateful with the blessed are thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Our Lady, seat of wisdom,
Pray for us.
Saint Thomas Aquinas.
Pray for us.
Please. So we're going to look at, if we get some time, we can try to get through some of this is what we call the 24 Thomistic Thesis. In other words, the popes in the past decided that if we look at the works of St. Thomas, the philosophical works, there are 24 main principles that the church wanted the priests and the seminaries to understand as a minimum of grasping the world around them, to be able to have a solid grounding in the philosophical principles that the church uses as the foundation stone for grasping deeper things. Now, here, these points, they are common sense points that in many ways you already understand. And as I said to the Father today, the rule I say is that the best philosopher is the one who knows how to make a cup of tea. Okay, and that's very true. Because to make a cup of tea, you have to observe certain rules, certain laws that you have to acknowledge. So, for example, today the modern philosophers, they deny the reality around them. So they say, that's not a banana, it's only a banana because we feel it's a banana. But you can't apply that principle, they say, when you're making a cup of tea, because you can't say, I feel that this water is a cup of tea. No one does that in their life. They actually have to boil the water, add the sugar, and add the milk and the tea. To make a cup of tea means you understand reality. All right. So this is why I say the best philosopher is the one who can make a cup of tea. And today, the philosophers of today are intellectually dishonest. That's the problem. But these principles of St. Thomas, they're not invented by St. Thomas. In fact, they're invented by the great pagan philosophers of the past, who just looked at the world around them and tried to understand that world around how it works. And they would, over the years, there was a lot of discussion, debate, different ideas, until you came basically to Aristotle, Plato, and then the philosophers after that. And then the Christian philosophers would later on take those ideas and clarify them, purify them from either the wrong terminology or just make it clearer and more precise than the pagans had, because we also have the help of the faith. The faith gives us a greater clarity into nature itself. So the main 24. We're going to look first at the first point. The first one is because in the past, in the time of Aristotle, there was this and Plato, there was this thought amongst the philosophers that came before them that everything is not real. Why? Because things are constantly changing. The water is constantly flowing. Young people are getting older. The flower comes forth, it buds, and then it dies. So maybe it's all fake. Maybe it's not real. And Aristotle and Plato would say, no, it's not that. It's not real. It's just that what it is, the thing that it is, it's got what we can. It is actually what it is, but it has within itself the ability to become something else. And this is why the church sums up in this statement that potency and act divide being in such a way that whatever is either pure act, and we'll explain that later, or of necessity it is composed of potency and act as a primary and intrinsic principle. And what does that mean? That means that you are sitting, but you potentially can be standing, but you can't be sitting and standing at the same time. We can say that person is sitting and standing at the same time verbally, but it can't be done actually. So we can say a thing is a square circle, but there's no such thing in real life as a square circle. It can be either only a square or a circle. So you can't necessarily do what you can say with your lips. You can't be sitting and standing at the same time. But what it does mean is that something, and everything in the world, with one exception, and that is God himself, has a potentiality to become something else while it is actually something at the present. So you are presently sitting, but you can be potentially standing. A tree can be a tree, but it can also be potentially charcoal. You can burn the tree. So everything in being in the world is divided into potency and act. That is, something is actual, or it is potentially something else. The only exception to that is God, because God cannot become something else. So He is what we call pure act, but nothing else is pure act. But God alone is what we call pure act, because God cannot become something else. That's why in the Old Testament He says to Moses, I am who am, not who was and will be, or who will be, but I am who am. I always am, and can only be an am. It cannot be a will be, or maybe, or might be. He cannot change in any way, shape, or form. Whereas everything else in the world is what it is, but it can change. It can become something else. And that's very important for us to understand. Something is what it is, and what it is true, but it can become something else. But that's also a very important point, because in this statement, Aristotle basically destroys the whole concept of evolution. In other words, why? Because it says a thing can only become what it has in its makeup the ability to become. A banana can never become an apple. It just doesn't have within its being the ability to become an apple. Aristotle already destroyed the concept of evolution long time before the modern world. And it's a very basic principle based on what we said of act and potency. A thing can only become what it has in its being potentially to become. So a boy, contrary to what the modern world says, can never become a girl, can only become a man, because it only has within his natural being the ability to become a man. He can't become a frog, can't become a dog, a cat, he can only become a man. And that also destroys the point of abortion, because the child, the conceived thing inside the mother, is potentially a man. So when you're killing, what are you killing? Potentially a man. And in fact, what's interesting about the abortionists is they will acknowledge that point when it comes to killing the fetus of an animal. You can't kill that dog or the whale or whatever, because that's potentially a whale. I understand that. But when it comes to a man, it's not a human being. Of course it is, because it's potentially a man or a woman or whatever it is. But that's what it's going to become. So when you're destroying that, that's what you're destroying. So again, that principle of Aristotle is very, very important. And you might say, Father, that's just common sense. Yes, it is common sense. And that's what we are studying. Philosophy is the study of common sense. And the more we understand that, the more we are grounded in that, the more profound is our common sense. And this is what we are lacking today, the common sense. There is a very funny statement that Father, one of the priests, he makes a statement regarding, he loved drinking wine. So he said, I love wine because it's potentially God. And what does he mean by that? Because wine, through the words of consecration, can become our Lord. So, but by itself, wine cannot become God, of course. But by means of added power given to this matter, through the words of consecration, it can become God. So that was his point in that. Using, and remember, so all the sacraments, when we speak about the sacraments, whether it's transubstantiation and the Mass, these are all philosophical terms that we use from philosophy to have a deeper understanding of the truths of our faith. And this is why these things are very important for us. And so the next point that St. Thomas is going to bring out is that since act is perfection, that is, sitting, if you're sitting, that's your state of perfection for that point in time. So whatever you are, in other words, a thing that when it's existing, it's alive, it's a good thing. So act, as it is a state of perfection. It is not limited excepting through potency. So you are limited only in as much as you can become something else. So you can become something else. God can't become something else. God is unlimited. Which is in itself a capacity for perfection. So the fact that you can change, you can be modified, is an ability for you to become better in some way, some other way. Whether standing is better for you or not, that's another thing. But the point is, if you can grow older, you can be molded or whatever, it's a sign that you have a power for greater perfection in you. Hence, in any order in which act is pure act, it will only exist in that order as unique and unlimited act. And the only thing that is pure act is God. God can't be changed. But whatever is finite and limited, if you want, and manifold, it has entered into a true composition with potency. So we are limited, we are finite, therefore we are composed of act and potency. We are something now, but we can always be modified in some way. Even when we die, you can still burn the person who's dead, or you can put him in the grave, whatever. As long as there's matter, there's always potential for change. Therefore, there's always going to be the reality of act and potency with matter. So, and God has no matter, and He cannot be modified in some way, unlike the angels. Angels have no matter, but they can be modified. We'll see that later. Consequently, the one God, unique and simple, alone subsists in absolute being. The only absolute being without composition is God. All other things that participate in being have a nature whereby their being is restricted, or limited. They are constituted of essence and being, really distinct principles. So you have a man who's made of manliness, whatever that is, and material. So we are made of, or what we say in philosophy, man is a rational animal. So animal aspect of us is there, but also what makes us different from all the other animals is that we are rational. So you combine those two things to make the one composite being, being a man. We are composite of matter and form. So we are made of, we are not simple like God, who is God is His own essence, whatever He is. So God is a unique creation, outside of all that we understand. This is why St. Thomas, when he asked about God, he didn't say who is God, but rather what is God? What sort of being is God that He's so different from everything else that we see around us? You know, like the first time you see something strange, your question normally is, what is that? It's something, but normally as a kid you poke it or you kick it just to see the reaction, to get some understanding of what is this thing. So St. Thomas says this, what is it? God is definitely totally different from being as we know it here on earth. A thing is called a being of essence. God and creatures are not called beings in the same way, nor wholly equivalent, but by analogy, by comparison. By analogy both of attribution and of proportionality. So we know the things around us, we look at the things around us, we say, okay, these are all beings, these are all things, and in this way we know something about God, but it's not the same being as us, it's not the same as us, but in the same way we do know something about Him. We know that God has a mind, has an intellect, but God is His intellect. We share, we are not our intellect, it's a part of us, whereas with God it is what He is, part of what God is not divided. But what we do know of God is true, but it's not true by an absolute comparison. It's just by a small analogy that we try to understand Him. It's the things here on earth, St. Thomas says, they're like a ladder that help us understand the higher things about God. But they're all limited in their comparison. Every comparison, says St. Thomas, limps a little bit, but at least they do help us grasp a little bit into the nature of God by looking at what we have here below. In every creature, there is also a real composition of subsisting subject and added secondary forms, accidental forms. We'll see that. Such compositions cannot be understood unless being in really receiving an essence distinct from the thing. So, me and you, I am not manhood. I am a man. I share in manhoodness, if you want, but I am not all of mankind. And that's an interesting point, because St. Thomas says that with regards to us, what differentiates us is our separate forms, our separate substances. So I am not you physically, and we have different ways of seeing things, but essentially we're all human beings. But he says in that case of the angels, that can't be true, because the angels don't have matter. So what divides one angel from the other? Well, St. Thomas says in the case of the angels, each angel is a totally unique and separate species. So like a cat and a dog, they're totally different species. With regards to us, we are not different species. What divides us is our matter. With regards to the angels, every individual angel is a totally unique individual species. But you might say, hold on, Father, the angels, don't we have the different choirs of angels? Yeah, that's in relation to their function, not in relation to their nature. Because each angel individually is their own complete species. So St. Michael can say, I am the only one like this. Not in the sense that I'm the only one with a pure spirit, no, they're all pure spirits, but in relation to what defines me from everyone else, I'm totally unique. Whereas we cannot say that we're all human beings, we all might be divided by our gender, but our biological makeup as human beings is the same. That's the makeup of people, mankind. The angels are, each one is individual, unique species. Because they don't have anything like us, as far as matter, to separate them. So what separates them is a unique species. Being the absolute accidents, there is also relative accidents. So for example, we're going to look at that, because there's another point here that St. Thomas is getting at, and that is, in everything, particularly we can see in relation to anything material, there's two aspects to everything. There is what we call the substance, and then the accidents. The substance is what makes a thing to be what it is. So what makes a dog to be a dog is its substance. But you can have a tall dog, small dog, large dog, brown dog, but they're all dogs. Same thing with a woman. You can have a tall, short, large, whatever you want, long hair, short hair. They're still all a woman. So there are something in that woman that makes her to be a woman, but there is something that's secondary that doesn't affect her being a woman, but it's still part of who she is. Long hair, brown hair, short hair, all those are accidents, accidental things. But the substance is what makes a thing to be what it is. So everything has those two aspects to it. The substance, what makes you to be essentially what you are, and that what doesn't make you, was not essential to who you are as a being. Whether it's you're tall, you're short, you're still a man or a male or a female. And that's what St. Thomas is saying here. They were saying that there are some relative accidents. What I mean by relative accidents in you that are not as such directly part of your makeup. For example, you might be a mother or a father, but that's something external to you. It's a relationship. You might be a brother, you might be a sister, you might be a friend of somebody. Those are relational accidents that are not, if you can't still look at a woman and say, oh, just by looking at her I can tell she's a mother. Well, you couldn't. But there is that accident that she has, and that's a very important point, because in heaven, when I asked our Lord, in heaven, all those people who are married, what's going to be their status? Well, our Lord says in heaven they're not going to be married anymore. But the relationship of once having been married, that will always remain. And that's my mother. When I go to heaven, my parents will still be they were my parents. That relation, which is accidental to who they are, that will always remain. Those relations, those accidental aspects are there in us as well. They are not essential to who we are, but they also are real. They are real as far as a reality that is there. And that's also, look at that point, that's also important when we look at, we'll come back to see later on, the question of the Trinity. Because in the Trinity there's also relationships. The Father is not the Son, and the Son is not the Father. But there is a real relationship between the two, and that has to be understood, acknowledged, and accepted, and is part of the real makeup of who the Trinity is as Trinity. So the same thing with us. There's going to be relations which we call accidents that are not essential to who we are, but they are also part of the reality of what we are in this world, in this life. So that's what St. Thomas is saying. Although by reason of its character, relation does not signify anything inherent in another. It's not part of what you are essentially. It is nevertheless often has a cause in things, and hence a real entity distinct from the subject. So you as mother and father, they bring forth life. They have a real relationship to the thing they bring in this world, but they're distinct from them. But at the same time, there's a certain importance in between the two in that relationship. So that's what St. Thomas is trying to clarify for us. And we see this more importantly when we look at the Trinity. A spiritual creature is wholly simple in its essence. It's not made up of parts. That's what he's saying. Yet there is still twofold composition in the spiritual creature, namely that of its essence with being, and that of the substance with accidents. So the angels that have accidents to them, they can move or be moved, accidental relationships to them, but they're still composed, even though they are simple. They're not made of parts, like we have arms, legs, and that. They're not made of parts. They're simple, but there's still a composition, intellect and will. All these aspects to them, which are still they are composition beings as existing as angels. Unlike God, God is totally simple without composition, and that's hard for us to try to grasp, but we'll come back to that. However, the corporal creature is composed of act and potency in its very essence. The part of essential of who we are and what we are is that we are composed, because of our matter. Matter has given us quite a limitation. It limits us. It says you are here. You exist in this amount of space if you want, and therefore you're limited, and therefore you've got a certain amount of power. You have a certain amount of power, but it's quite very, very limited because of the fact that you're confined to this little space as a creature. These act and potency in order of essence are designated by the names of form and matter. So matter and the form is basically, I don't think of the word form as shape, but form is essentially what determines you to be what you are. So your matter is if you want, the equivalent of dough. Let's say you take dough or clay, that's the matter, but the form, whatever you mold it to be, is what separates it from every other thing, all the other clay, or the other dough. You can make bread, you can make cake, you can make many things with dough. But what separates the one is how you've molded it, what you've done with it. Same thing with the clay, how you've molded it, what you've done with it. Is it a plate? Is it a cup? And yet, they're made of the same stuff. The clay, you can make a cup, and you can make a plate. But a cup and a plate are not the same thing. What's separated them? It's not the matter, it's the form. The form which gives the determination to what the thing actually is. I hope that, does that make sense? So that's why St. Thomas is saying, okay, we've got the matter, okay, but what makes you different is not just the matter, because on the level of us as animals, we are plenty of animals in the world, whales, fish. What makes us different is the form, and it's the form which makes us rational human beings made of matter. Yes, made up of matter. So fish is not a dog, and a dog is not a fish. They're all separated not just by matter, they're all by matter, but by their form, and that's what makes everything distinct from each other in this world. And then we look next at the principle of what is called cosmology, looking at things from below upward. Neither the matter nor the form have being of themselves. Nothing exists by itself. Everything depends for its existence for something else. Nor are they produced or corrupted of themselves, nor are they included in any category otherwise than reductively as substantial principles. Everything depends on something else or someone else for its existence, excepting God. God is what Aristotle said, the unmoved mover. He's the first cause for everything else. And when we ask the question, well, who created God? This is a common question. The reason we can't actually answer that is because God doesn't exist the same way we exist. We exist, we share in life, we share in existence. God holds us in his existence. But God doesn't exist in the same way we exist. And therefore, when we think of who made God, we think of it the same way, well, who made Johnny, who made the car, but God doesn't exist in that same way that we exist. And therefore, that question can't be answered by our limited minds, because our concept of existence and God's real existence, they're not the same at all. And that's what makes it hard for us to comprehend. We exist in God. We exist in the mind of God, who's made everything, and in Him and by Him and through Him, and not without Him. If God forgot about us, we wouldn't just be lost in space. We would cease to be anything at all, totally. And a comparison I often give for that is, you do this the same in your mind. So if you think in your mind of a banana, of an apple, and then later you forget about it, what happens to it? It's not put in the back of your mind. It's not taking up space, and it's totally gone. Same thing with God. If God just forgot about us, if you want, we would cease to exist. There would not be a blank. There would not be a darkness. And even that in our minds, we can't. Even the concept of nothing, we can't even put it in our minds. The concept of eternity, we can't put it in our mind. We can say the word, but we actually can't comprehend nothing. We can't think of nothing. We can think of a blank space, darkness, but that's not nothing. There's still something. Even darkness is still something. So if we can't comprehend even that, how much less can we comprehend when we speak about the existence of God? We can't. It's totally different reality that our minds don't even understand. And this is why it is very hard to even begin to look at that question fairly, objectively. Although extension in quantitative parts, so a matter is large or small, follows upon corporeal nature. So the fact that when you talk about large, you're talking about something, some sort of matter. It's large person or small person. Nevertheless, it is not the same for a body to be a substance and for it to be quantified. For of its substance is indivisible, not indeed as a part. So you're talking about man, but you can't divide mankind. You can take an individual man and you can cut him into pieces, but when you're talking about his substance as being a man, well, you can't say, well, if I cut out this part of him, I will cut out the manhood of him. He will cease to be a man. No, you can't do that. But you can cut parts of his matter, yes, but the matter isn't his substance. And this is, in the beginning, when God made Adam and Eve, the Bible says that Adam was given the role of naming things. But how did Adam name something? How do when we name something, we make up a name to it. But the name is supposed to signify the substance of a thing. And we are, so a rose, an orange tree, a banana tree. The name that Adam was giving to the things was supposed to be spot on as to what they were according to their nature. Adam would have got that right because he was given an infused gift to be able to do that. And obviously since then we just passed on the same names for generations of things. Maybe we've added or modified them accordingly. But the name is supposed to, we're talking about the name of a thing, not an individual. Not that's my nice little dog and we call him Johnny now. But the very name of a dog or a cat, that is supposed to signify the very substance of what that thing is, what it is in its very nature. And this is what St. Thomas is saying. You can't cut up the nature, but you can cut parts of the thing, but you're still not destroying the nature when you're not taking it away from the fact that it's a cat. Even if you cut up its arms, it's still a cat. And this is what St. Thomas is saying. You have to make a distinction. When we're talking about cutting a cat and the very fact that it's a cat, they're not the same thing. You can cut parts of the cat, you can cut parts of the man, but it's still a man. And that's this point again. This thing is all very important today when we talk about this, gender identity. It's very important. You see, St. Thomas, these principles are very solid. They help us, give us an insight into making those distinctions. Okay, as to what is a thing? And we're talking about something. So, for in itself, substance is indivisible, not indeed as a point is indivisible, but as that which falls outside the order of dimensions is indivisible. But quantity, which gives the substance extension, really differs from the substance and is truly an accident. So whether you're large, you're fat, you're skinny, you're small, it's something accidental to who you are. You might be able to extend a person by pulling them or making them fatter or feeding them more, which is can be helpful if you're raising cattle. You want to feed them and you want to make them big and fat so you can have more steak if you want, and that's a very good thing, a necessary thing. But you're not going to make it more of a cow. That's the point. It's still a cow. Whether it's a skinny cow or a large cow, it's still a cow. And that can't be extended. That can't be made more or less of. You can't be more or less a man. You're either a man or you're not a man. And again, a very important point. Today you hear this this notion in the church. You often use it in relation to traditional Catholics. They're not in full communion. Well, either you're a Catholic or you're not. You can't be more or less a Catholic. Either a Catholic or you're not a Catholic. You either believe in God in the creed or you don't. You can't have. It can't be I'm less a Catholic or I'm more a Catholic. Any more than you can be. It's more a cow or it's less a cow. It's either a cow or it's not. This point is very important. You can see these philosophical principles, they apply to everything. So this is what St. Thomas is saying, get this point right and make the necessary distinctions. The principle of individuation, so how do we divide all of us? By, we numbered as 10 people in the room. Why? Because we're separate by what? Our matter. And this is what St. Thomas says, that the principle of individuation, of numerical distinction of one individual from another with the same specific nature, is matter designated by quantity. So matter, that's each got matter, different matter, but it's quantified by the number, which will be divided by our matter. So St. Thomas is saying that by virtue of a body's quantity itself, the body is circumscriptly in a place, and in one place alone, circumscriptly, no matter what power might be brought to bear. So this is a very important point. So a thing is where it is. So you might think, what's the point? That's obvious, right? And that's a very important point. So you apply this to hell or heaven. There are bodies in heaven. Therefore, heaven is a place because a body takes up space. And for it to take up space means it's in a place. Same thing in hell. You might say, well, what about hell? Hell, we're not sure if there's any bodies in there, if you want to say. Okay. Well, even if there were no bodies in there, what is sure in hell is that they are being punished. That's a dogma of our faith. So they're being acted upon. They're not acting themselves because in hell they don't have the use of their faculties. They've lost that freedom. So, but they are being acted upon. Where they're being acted upon is a place because the action is taking place somewhere, and this is the point. Wherever an action is taking place, this is why St. Thomas, when he says, "Where are the angels?" the answer is the angels are where they act, where they're impacting, what they're doing. St. Michael might be in Australia, he might be in America, might be in Africa. What he's doing, wherever he is, where he's acting. Your guardian angel is where he's acting. It's either an active thing or a passive thing, but it's taking place somewhere, and they're doing something, they're impacting something. And this is why St. Thomas says that a body is where it is, because it's taking up space, and takes up space. And again, this also applies to literally the space out there. There's all these planets, and there's bodies in those planets. Bodies, we call them planets, or whatever you want to call them, stars and all that. They are taking up space, their bodies, and they're in a real place. And how, when people speak to me about the end of the universe, well, what's at the end? Is there like a brick wall or something? We don't know. So to speak about the end of the universe, it's something that is actually something that, both it's a fairy tale concept, but at the same time hard even to grasp. Because when you speak about the end, well, what's at the end? Who knows? And what makes it the end? Is it because you can't go any further? And what says that you can't go any further? No one can answer this question. No one knows the answer to this question. Because as far as we know, space is defined in our minds by things that are out there. So when we think about outer space, we don't just think of a blank slate in our mind. We think of something, the stars, the planets, the universe, the galaxies, all these things that we think of that are out there. They're all ornamented, they're all these beautiful ornaments in heaven, in the sky, but they're all related to space and bodies that are out there. So, because they're taking up a place, and in our mind there's all these things in there, whatever you want to imagine that are there, you're free to, but the point is, these bodies take up space, they take up a place. And therefore, we speak about here on earth with the mathematical graphs, we talk about linear graphs where a thing is located in relation to something else. And that's the way we map out the world. It's always in relation to some other part of the world. Australia is related to that because they're all places taking up space, but also in relation to each other. So they're not just in the middle of nowhere. They're all in relation to each other, and that relation is again something that's very important, because if you want to get to from one place to another, you're going to that relationship of distance, time, space is going to be important. So that reality also applies in relation to all bodies that you can think of, whether it's dirt, whether it's the Mars, it's all related. Here St. Thomas says, bodies are divided into two groups. For some are living and others are devoid of life. So like the planets, they're not, or the earth itself, it's not a living thing. In the case of living things, in order that there be the same subject, an essential moving part and an essentially moved part, the substantial form, which is designated by the same soul, requires an organic disposition. In other words, in living things, there has to be something which animates the whole. And that's why we do say that animals do have souls that are part of the animal, but it dies with the animal, because it's the soul that moves the thing. Once the soul is corrupted or separated from the thing, the physical thing dies and is no longer able to animate itself. So this is why St. Thomas says that amongst the things that are material, some are alive and some are dead, like the planets. The planets can't move themselves by themselves. They depend on something else or someone else to move them and keep them in coordinate movement. And we'll see that later on. But everything else is moved that is living, and what defines that it's living is the fact that it's able to move itself or by itself. So even somebody who's what we call medically bed bound, they're still within themselves, there's still life within them. So as long as that, then you say they're alive, they're living, because they are keeping themselves in living motion. But the moment that their soul is separated from their body, corruption sets in, they say that this person is dead. Same thing with a human being or an animal. The soul, in terms of this sense, the soul is the vegetative and sensitive orders cannot subsist of themselves, nor are they produced of themselves. Nothing brings self into existence. Okay, something always requires something else to bring itself to bring something else to life. Rather, they are no more than principles whereby the living thing exists and lives. And since they are wholly dependent on matter, they are incidentally corrupted through the corruption of the composite. So once corruption sets in, the whole thing begins to die. And in theology, we say that once corruption sets in the body, we can be pretty certain the person's soul has been separated from the body. Once there is the smell, the bones are all crawled up on themselves and the body is beginning to decompose, you can be sure that the soul has left the body. Because what keeps it animated, what keeps it going, not just in parts, but as a whole, is the soul. And that applies both to the animals and to human beings. Both it's the soul that animates the whole, and once the soul is separated, the thing starts to decompose and to divide within itself. Everything within the human body starts to become totally separated, whether it's the heart, the lungs, everything. It might sit there physically, but scientifically we know it all starts to fall apart and divide and corrupt in such a way that it disintegrates. They're no longer actually united. And it's what keeps them in unity and keeps them going in a unified way is the soul. And this is what St. Thomas is saying. On the other hand, the human soul subsists of itself. The human soul, that is the spirit, doesn't depend upon the matter, but the matter to survive depends upon the soul. When it is infused into a sufficiently disposed subject, it is created by God. By its very nature, it is incorruptible and immortal. The soul is incorruptible of man, it's incorruptible and immortal. And it's by that very fact, it's immaterial. Because it's incorruptible, it's not something that is material. So the brain, your soul is not your brain. For us, the soul uses the material side of the brain as a tool for reasoning, but in the next life, or even once your soul is separated from your body, the soul no longer uses the mind to rationalize in those things by means of infused knowledge. Much like you in this life, you might look at something or someone and you automatically understand without them telling you anything. You just understand what it is that they're trying to say or what's going on without anybody having told you anything. Automatically you grasp, and that's you automatically have that knowledge. And an example a little bit of this is when you're sleeping, you understand certain things, you see certain things, and yet there's no bodily. You're not talking. You're not in the real world. You're asleep. But you're still grasping things, and in the dream you're understanding things without somebody coming and writing it on the board or reading it to you. There's an infused knowledge taking place in a similar way, but in a far more higher level. The soul, when it's separated from the body, no longer knows things by means of the senses. It knows things by means of infused knowledge. That's how the angels communicate. The angels don't have a language, they don't speak. They communicate with each other by means of infused knowledge, that they impart one to the other. And that's basically how God, at the very beginning, gave that knowledge to Adam and Eve to know, because they were created as adults. How did they know to do the things they had to do? Well, God gave them the infused knowledge of how to go about things, life, building, making things, growing things, without having them read or study or being taught. It was infused into them. And so this is the way the soul works without the body. But in the body, the soul does not know anything excepting through the senses. So we rely on the five senses that God has given us to gain knowledge of the exterior world around us. From the human soul, there are naturally issued forth powers pertaining to two orders, the organic and the non-organic, to life and non-life and dead things. The organic powers, among which are the senses, so with the five senses, have a composite as their subject. So they rely on the body. To the five senses, hearing, taste, touch, smell, we rely on our body for that. The non-organic powers, the soul alone has as their subject. Hence, the intellect is a power intrinsically independent of the body. It does rely on the body to know things, but without the body, you still have an intellect, you still have a mind. But the body in this world, the intellect in this world, knows things through the senses, and then through that, it also, after that point, it forms a judgment from what it's taken from the world. You put your hand on fire, you realize that's painful, so the mind says, don't do that, that's not good for me, because it's going to harm me. So that's a judgment that the mind has made by taking from what's external in the world to say, okay, I needed the knowledge of the senses in order to make the right judgment in the situation, but now I've understood these things, I'm no longer dependent upon the senses to make this judgment anymore. So this is an ability that is given to the intellect. Intellectually, necessity follows upon immaterial and therefore, furthermore, in such manner that the further the distance from form, the higher degree of intellectuality. In other words, the less you need to depend upon matter to understand, the greater is your insight, the greater is your wisdom, your understanding. Any being is the adequate object of understanding in general. So anything you look at, taste, touch, smell, you can learn something from it by means of the senses in order to make whatever judgment you need to make. But in the present state of union of soul and body, things, qualities abstracted from material conditions of individuality, are the proper object of the human intellect. And that's a very important point. So an animal, a cow and a human being can look at a tree, and they both see a tree, but only the human being can say, that's a tree. The animal can see trees, but it can never say, these are trees. You'll never grasp that these are trees. All you'll see is individual trees. to make the next judgment after seeing all these things, saying these are trees, that's a judgment that is abstracted from the external world, and you then make a judgment in your mind as to what these things are. The animals can't do that. That's only an intellectual mind that can say, oh, these are trees. This is why an animal can never build a house, can never advance further than all of its ancestors have done for the last how many thousands of years they've been alive, because all they can do is,
Sorry, just a question on that. But they know food
yes,
when they say it.
they
The cow knows not to eat a rock.
individual thing, yes. And they can smell it, they
Yeah.
can hear it, they can taste it, and they can acquire the knowledge of this thing, but they can't say that this is an apple. They just say, I like this thing. You can train itself, or you can train it by means of these things. But it will never be able to say or grasp that this is an apple. But it will be able to grasp, I like this thing, I've seen it every time, I know it, and I've smelt it before, and I've eaten it before, because it's got sense memory. That it certainly has in common with us.
Okay.
But to make the next judgment, you can never do that.
Isn't that instinct?
That's part of instinct, yeah. Instinct and sense memory. So they have a sense memory, and that's why you'll see, like dogs, for example, sometimes, or other animals, it's like they dream. They do see things in their sleeping. It's their sense memory does come back to them. They do have that, and the more higher forms of animal life, like the chimpanzees and dolphins, have a lot more higher sense memory than most primitive animals like snakes and that. But yeah, they have some things that give us the impression that this thing is rational, but it's relying on. And some animals, like the chimpanzee, they have a high level of sense memory, so they can remember things from a long further back. And the dumber the animal, the smaller is their memory. So they can remember things only maybe half an hour, and that's it. And God made them all different for different reasons, different purposes, and different functions in the world. But they do have sense memory. But to grasp and make a judgment, they're not able to do that. They have a judgment in the sense that they know this is good or that's bad from experience and that. Yeah, you're harmful, you're going to do something bad. Dogs are very good like that. But it's not an intellectual judgment of a principle that they can't do. Therefore, we receive knowledge from sensible things, and that's very important. Why is that important? Because what St. Thomas is saying here, by this obvious point, is actually we don't make reality. All we do is, contrary to what the modern world wants you to believe, we have to submit to the reality around us by means of the five senses. This is the way we come in contact with the world around us. We don't determine reality, we have to submit to it. And that is a very humiliating thing for modern man. And this is why the modern philosophers are different, where they differ from St. Thomas. St. Thomas says we know the reality by means of the five senses, and without them, we don't know anything, actually. We don't determine what makes an apple an apple. All we do is acknowledge that an apple is an apple. For the modern philosopher, we decide what's an apple. We decide what's a banana. Actually, no, you don't. You wouldn't know an apple or a banana without your senses. And that's why when you start to get into the world of someone like Descartes, who made the principle of I think, therefore I am, well, you're lost forever once you believe that. Because you think, therefore you exist because you think, then you're living in your existence. You're living in your mind, and you'll never be able to get out of your mind. St. Thomas says, no, I think, I think because I've got the five senses, and I've been given these gifts by God to be able to think, but what I think is what I see from the outside world, and therefore it makes me deeply seated in, grounded on the earth, not in Disneyland, not in my mind. Because if my mind determines reality, then I'm stuck in my mind forever, and I'll never be able to get out of it. And then each one is basically making up his own reality as he sees fit, and that's the modern world. I determine what's right and wrong. We are simply servants of the world around us, and we take it in by the five senses, and we know it by means of the five senses, and this is how we form our judgments of the things that we see around us. We are limited, and we are servants of the senses that help us to know things. And this is why St. Thomas says when we are born as a blank slate, and that slate is impacted upon by means of the five senses, and therefore we can make judgments, knowledge, and things. And again, in practice, we have to follow that in regards to science, because no one just says, wakes up one day and says, I think water should boil at 20 degrees. No one does. We look at what the scientists before us have come up with and discovered in existing laws, pre-existing laws in nature, and we take those laws and realities and we build up from them. No one says, I've decided that I'm going to make electricity, or I'm going to make light by means of spontaneously, because I think it would be good, and I think that would be nice too. But in reality, nobody operates like that.
So someone born blind, deaf and dumb, had no feeling, could never know anything?
He can only know what his senses are giving, and if he's got no senses, then he can know nothing. Yes. Yeah, without those senses. And we even have this expression, try to imagine explaining colour to a person born blind. How do you do that? What's his reference?
We only know it's an apple because someone way back called it an apple.
That's right.
If they called it
Yes.
something else,
Yes.
we would know it as something else.
Yes, that's right.
So, with a trained animal like a dog or a cat, you can say, food bowl, and he knows that over there is the food bowl.
Yes.
So he only knows what he hears, as well as we know the apple.
That's right.
The dog looks at a tree and thinks it's a toilet.
So sorry?
Yeah, that's true. Yes, that's right. Yes. He can't say, he can't abstract what we think from that. Yeah, but for him that's totally and for many reasons he of experience, notice what dogs do, they'll smell around there, because their fellow dogs will be on there, and that's how they know there's a scent, that for the dog has come. Again, it's both instinct and sense memory that come into, and it's God has put that in them for their benefit and their preservation. It's like, how in the world does a spider know how to make those elaborate webs? Beyond comprehension. But that's something that not they've studied, went to school, but it's something that just God's automatically put in them. Like chickens, I've just never understood how they know just to sit on that egg. No one taught them, the grandfather, no one explained it to them. It's just instinctive. They just know I'm going to sit on the egg. How God's built it into them for their preservation, and for our benefit, but also for their preservation of their nature, their species.
Sometimes a rooster will sit on an egg.
Sometimes you will.
How do you get it wrong?
Yeah, I guess it's wrong. But again, it's an instinctive thing in the creature. How did you learn it? Where did you? No one can answer that, because they're not taught by anybody, and yet they instinctively know to do that thing. That's an instinctive thing in them that other creatures don't do, other animals don't do. So God has put it in the very nature of that thing, which goes back to what I said earlier. A thing is what it is, and it's made that way by its very substance. It is an apple is an apple, a chicken is a chicken, and a chicken is not a dog. And the very fact that that's all it can be, because that's what's made up in its very structure, its very essential aspect of what it is, and that we call its substance. Through these intelligible likenesses or species, we directly know universals. In other words, when we talk about a tree, we're not talking about an individual tree, because you can have large trees, small trees, big trees, but we're talking about the universal concept of a tree, or a banana, or of a man, or even the higher things like when we speak about truth, love, laws, principles. There's not that you can't say, there's laws. Laws don't walk around. No, the universal things that only our mind can grasp. You don't see, there's love walking around. No. What you know is you understand the concept of love. It's a universal concept, but you don't see it. It's not walking around. It doesn't have a physical aspect to it. But it's something that your mind alone can grasp. But we grasp these things from the world around us. We attain to singulars by our senses. We see the individual thing, and also by our intellect. When it beholds the thing in itself, we see a man or a woman. But we ascend to the knowledge of spiritual things by comparison. So you see this one man, and then you see other men. You say, these are all men. So you understand that there are men in the world, not just one man or one thing. the will does not precede the intellect, but follows upon it. In other words, your will only loves what it knows. So it's a blind faculty, your will. Your will follows your intellect. And your intellect tells you this is good, and the will follows the intellect. I like this ice cream, and the will, I want the ice cream. The will necessarily desires that which is presented to it as good in every respect, satisfying the appetite. So the aspect, if you tell the monster this ice cream is nice, the will wants the ice cream. The question of morality is not determined by the will, it's determined by the intellect. The intellect knows, well, yeah, I want this thing, but it's not lawful, it's wrong, it's immoral. The will probably say, who gives the will? All right, I want this thing, but the intellect, for example, the dog is not going to say, well, it's Friday, it's Good Friday, I'm fasting, I'm not eating meat today. The dog's not, all he knows is meat and I'm hungry. All right, but there's no question of morality there. There's a question of I'm hungry and I'm going to eat. Whereas alone the man can say, oh, this is immoral. I know I would like to eat this thing or whatever, but it's a Good Friday or it's Friday or whatever. Or being drunk is a nice feeling, but it's not right. It's not moral. And the intellect has to put the will in check. So, okay, I know you'd like to get drunk, but it's not good. So you've got to have less detail. So this is what St. Thomas is saying. But it is freely chooses among the many goods that are presented to it as desirable according to changeable judgments or evaluations. Consequently, the choice follows the final practical judgment, but the will is the cause of its being final one. In other words, as I said, the will, see, the mind presents something to the will as good, and then the will can say, well, I don't care about the morality of it, I want it. And if you're weak-willed, you will follow whatever you see as presenting it as good, even though you might intellectually know it's wrong. So Paul mentions that. He says, I know what's right and wrong, but I do that which is wrong, because when our Lord says the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. So obviously the will, the intellect has to overpower the will for the will to do the right thing or more properly. The will has to be trained in virtue for it to choose the right thing at the right time, because the will is a blind faculty. It doesn't necessarily follow what is moral. It follows itself, but it has to be put in check by the intellect. So that's why we follow our mind and not our passions. And then St. Thomas says, we do not perceive by immediate intuition that God exists. It's not a straightforward thing, nor do we prove it a priori, but we prove it a posteriori. In other words, from the things that have been created. And St. Paul says that we know that God exists because the world and the things and all these things that exist.
So can you repeat the two philosophical terms, a priori and posteriori?
So we do not perceive by an immediate intuition that God exists, nor do we prove it a priori. It's going backward. But we do prove it a posteriori. From the fact, we go back. From the effect, we go back to the cause. That's what he's saying. So you see a broken window. Well, from the broken window, you know somebody broke it. It doesn't just break by itself. So you see the world, and then you see the order, the structure, and you say, well, I didn't put it here, my grandparents didn't put it here, some greater being put it here, and that greater being we called God. The first uncaused cause, he put it here. And if we keep going backward, we go back infinity, well, there's got to be a beginning, because nothing comes by itself. Somebody's put it there. So who put it there? Well, the first uncaused cause, that's God. So that's what St. Thomas is saying. So from things that are created, following an argument, the effects to the same cause. Namely, from things which are moved and cannot be the adequate source of their own motion. In other words, these things move, but who was the first mover who moved it all? Who put it all in motion? So first unmoved mover, and that was the name that Aristotle gave to God, the first unmoved mover, the first cause. From the production of the things in this world by causes subordinate to one another, to a first uncaused thing. From the corruptible thing which equally might be or not be. So whether you exist or don't exist doesn't change the world. But to an absolute necessary being, from which more or less living and understand according to the degree of beings living and understanding that to that which is maximally understood, maximally living and maximally obeying. Finally, from the order of all things to a separate intellect which has ordered and organized things and directs them to the end. And God directs everything in the universe, in the stars, the planets, on earth, to their final end, to their final purpose in this life and this world. So everything depends upon a higher cause for them first to exist, and then we also say to stay in existence and to continue in existence. That is something that we refuse to accept or understand, and that is not only does God create the world and bring it into existence, but if God forgot about the world, it would actually cease to exist. So God also keeps us in existence. It doesn't just, and then by that, we are not saying that God does not use secondary causes. Yes, we need to eat and drink and sleep there. Yeah, but the whole thing is upheld by God keeping it in existence. If God took that part out, the whole thing would collapse. But within that reality, yes, we do need to eat and drink and sleep and that, and keep ourselves warm, and those things that keep us warm and the things that we eat and drink, they do keep us alive, yes. But we're not talking about keeping you alive. We're talking about keeping you in existence, even far higher than keeping you just physically alive. The fact that you exist in this world and that this world exists is all upheld and maintained in existence by God. That is for us hard to comprehend a little bit. And it's hard for us to comprehend how that affects the here and now of my life and this world. That's even harder for us to say, well, let's say God forgot about me or the world. How can you prove scientifically that it's going to change the world? Well, you can't prove it scientifically. I know that there is a scientist who might be one of the best living minds in the modern world, Dr. Wolfgang Smith, probably one of the greatest minds living today. But he says when you look at the world on the molecular structured level, he says a lot of it is inexplainable because of the fact that on that level we start to see a little bit of everything actually depending upon God for its existence. But that's still a little bit harder for the average person to grasp. He's talking more on the minute molecular scientific structure of things. And that's a bit harder still to prove. It's still not easy to prove. But by the reason of the very purity of his being, God is distinguished from all limited beings. Hence it follows in the first place that the world could only have come from God by creation. Secondly, that not even by way of a miracle can any finite nature be given creative power. So me or you, we cannot ever be given the power to create out of nothing as God does, which of itself directly attains the very being of anything, any being. And finally, that no created agent can in any way influence the being of any effect unless it has in itself been moved by the first cause. In other words, everything in the universe can only ultimately depend upon God. And nothing is, so when parents give birth to a child in this life, as such, the life of the child becomes independent from the parents. So if the parents die, the child doesn't die, the child can still be alive, and that's what normally happens. Whereas with us, if God died, we'd all die. We depend upon God as not only the creator, but also the keeper in existence for all things. So this is the general summary. But from here, from these principles, you can deduce so many basic points to see and understand the errors of the modern world. So that it will hopefully give you some insight. And a lot of these points, again, were answered already in the 13th century, and St. Thomas is only building upon the great minds that came before him. And what is beautiful about St. Thomas is not that he was original, not that he came up with some new ideas, but that he took all the great minds before him, he synthesized them, he summarized them, he purified where they went wrong, but he just built on that wisdom of objective external reality and summarized it for us in very much simple language and looked at what the great minds said before him, and he didn't care whether they were Muslim, whether they were Jews, whether they were pagans, doesn't matter. What did they say? Is it true? And how can we grasp that point? How do we see that point to help us better understand reality, life around us, the world around us, and then obviously because philosophy becomes a great tool later on for us in theology. So when we speak about transubstantiation, well, there's two words that we built on. We spoke about substance. Well, the substance of what makes bread to be bread is being changed into what? The substance of what makes God to be God. But the accidents, what makes bread, whether it's white bread, brown bread, short bread, small bread, those are accidental to bread. They remain the same. The accidents remain the same, but the substance of what makes bread to be bread is no longer there. But we've used philosophical terms, substance, accidents, trans, in order to understand more deeply what's taking place in the mystery of the Blessed Sacrament. So that's why the highest science is not philosophy. Highest science is theology, but philosophy is the tool for which we use as a stepping stone to grasp more clearly the terms that we use in philosophy and theology. So, but they are important because if you get those terms wrong, you're going to get concepts wrong in your faith. That's why the modernists, they get their philosophy wrong. Vatican II is full of errors in philosophy. Not even so much in theology as it is philosophy. But you get those wrong, you're going to draw wrong conclusions in your theology later on. You're going to draw dire consequences in your theology, because if you're not understanding these terms, and again, notice that the modernists, they'll use the same words, but they don't have the same meanings. So for them, they talk about appearances, but for us, the appearance is the external, accidental reality. But for us, that external reality also has a substance which makes the thing to be essentially what it is, not accidentally what it is. It's essentially, this is different. A male is different from a female, essentially. But as far as the accidents and all these things, but as far as the soul, we're neither female nor male. This is very important. It's not the soul that makes you male or female. It's the body. But the body, the soul works according to the operations of the body. And again, these are all philosophical terms which we apply to nature, to reality, that are a great help for us. And that's why I think, yes.
Psychologists today is 5 minutes to complete.
Yeah, the nuns can't be. Yeah. Can I miss the nuns?
It might have gone the other way. Who knows?
Okay, that's
So it's correct to say a male soul or a female soul?
There's no such thing. Your soul is not male or female. It's material. It's spiritual. It's the body. That's the.
Sorry, Father. Just what were these things called? 24 principles. What was the study talk? This
24 Thomistic Thesis.
Gotcha.
And St. Pius X sets them out in his most appropriate on St. Thomas Aquinas.
And what's that called, sir?
It's called Doctoris Angelici, in 1914 of Pope St. Pius X. And it's the basic principles which all the clergy were expected to know. And that's just the minimum. We haven't scratched the surface. But they are quite helpful. Because if you got that right, you can basically answer any of the right areas just with those points we looked at today.
It was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Pray for us. Pray for us.
Can you give us a blessing, sir?
Yeah,